Well, I was on the way to Akron in the company with a number of newly found business friends. We expected, as I think I said outside, that we would capture a company. Of course, drunk-like, I expected to be the president. Well, what about to work with alcoholics? Oh, well, I would, do it on the side. So bravely we set out. The proxy fight came off. Our side was handsomely licked. All of them went home, but I stayed in the hotel for the simple reason I didn't have the fare and no one offered to give it to me. So here I was on a Saturday afternoon, alone in the Mayflower Hotel at Akron, Ohio. I walked down to the lobby, strode back and forth. At one end there was a plaque with the names of the various churches and preachers. At the other end of my beat there was a bar room. The bar room was filling up, and so were the people in it. And that buzz, so characteristic of bars, had a pleasant sound to me. Soon I found myself saying, well, perhaps I could go in there and have a drink of ginger ale and possibly scrape an acquaintance to pass away this lonely afternoon. And then I caught myself and thought, well, I have been restored to sanity. I can see I'm in danger. I walked over to the church directory again, thinking, well, now perhaps I had better find an alcoholic that I might talk to. Because at last, I see that I need such a person as much as he could possibly need me. No more of this preaching I had been doing in New York. So here I was, standing in front of the church directory, wondering what next. It suddenly occurred to me that perhaps one of the preachers on the list there could refer me to a drunk that I might work on. My fingers slid down across the list and finally stopped at the name of Walter Tunks, later to become a wonderful friend of AA, and who happened to be the Episcopal rector in town. So I called up the good Reverend, explained my need for a drunk to work on. At first he was rather nonplussed. He almost remarked that one drunk at a time is enough. Anyhow, he caught the drift of what I needed, and he referred me to still another person, a member of the Oxford groups in Akron. And from him, I secured a list of about 10 people that might, any one of them, put me in contact with a drunk. Well, I felt better, went upstairs, got on the phone, and one after one, the calls fell through. They didn't answer. They could perhaps see me in church on Sunday. One after another, the list was all gone, excepting the very last name. And this name was Henrietta Seiberling. And I connected her with Frank Seiberling, the rubber tycoon who I had met years before. Well, I couldn't imagine going to Mrs. Seiberling on a Saturday afternoon, asking if she knew of a drunk that I might work on. I even went downstairs and walked up and down some more. Suddenly, something said to me, you had better call that number. So I did call, and a warm southern voice came over the wire. This was Henrietta Seiberling. She was the daughter-in-law, not the one I thought. I explained my need, and she said, well, I'm no alcoholic, but I've had my troubles. I think I understand. Won't you come right straight out here? In no time, I stood before Henrietta's house, which was the gatehouse to that great estate. She met me in the door. showed me in and listened while I poured out my story. Finally, she said, I think you should meet Dr. Bob. He's a surgeon here in town. He's been in our Oxford groups. He's tried all sorts of cures. I'm sure he wants to stop drinking, but he simply can't. The family is in awful shape. The kids are in disarray. Henrietta went on to say that Ann Smith, Bob's wife, was about on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Moreover, the mortgage on the house was close to being foreclosed. Things just simply couldn't be worse. So, said Henrietta, would you like to talk with him? Well, I certainly thought I would. I needed him as much as he needed me.
Fine, Bill. Suppose we have a cup of coffee.
Good idea. That looks grand. Sugar lady.
Take any cream.
No, never got back to it. Well, shall we go on? Henrietta got onto the phone, and Ann Smith replied immediately. Was Dr. Bob there? Well, said Ann Smith, he's just come in. As you know, it's Mother's Day. He's brought me a wonderful potted plant, but I'm afraid, Henrietta, that we can't come. He is so potted that the plant is on the table, but he is on the floor under the table and can't get up. Maybe we can do better tomorrow. I shall never forget the next day. It was a Sunday. Henrietta had had me out there for an early dinner, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell rang, and there stood Dr. Bob and Ann. Ann looking slightly hopeful, but Bob not looking a bit like a founder. He was shaking violently. He said, I have another engagement. I don't believe that I can stay but a few minutes. Henrietta took in the situation at once, and with her usual understanding, she insisted that Dr. Bob and I go into the library where we could chat. So here it was. One drunk talking to another, because the one talking needed the message too. So first I unfolded Dr. Silkworth's ideas about alcoholism, how it was an actual disease, how the body developed a sensitivity which he called an allergy, and worse still, how the mind and emotions began to be beset with a compulsion that condemned us to go on drinking, and therefore to go mad or to die, a point at which Dr. Bob was certainly approaching. Afterward, he told me that the transmission of this bad news, how medically hopeless he was the thing that probably triggered his recovery. In fact, if you wish to look up his story in the AA book, you can see from his point of view how this all happened. Meanwhile, I told him about the possibility of a chain reaction about drunks, or among drunks, about all of my failures in New York. Well, it was one of AA's great hours. Afterward, Dr. Bob, having forgotten entirely about his hangover, and invited me to come and stay at their house, which I did, the better to carry on the proxy fight. Well, we had a great companionship over there. There was Bible reading in the morning, 2 or 3 times a day, coffee. Bob got back on the job, and he began to feel much better, and his drinking stopped abruptly. But one day he said to Ann and me, rather shyly, that the time had come for him to go down to Atlantic City to that usual yearly medical convention. Ann's face fell, but I signaled her to let him go, and she did. Nothing was heard of the upcoming founder for some 5 days, when the conductor spilled him off the train at 4 o'clock in the morning at Akron. He was too sheepish to call up his house, where we were. He called up his nurse, and she and her husband came and got him, took him there, and when he had been put under a little treatment, they brought him back to his own home. Well, then developed a terrible dilemma. It happened that 3 days since, or 3 days afterward, rather, that Dr. Bob must perform an operation, something he had begun, a piece of work on the operating table that he just had to complete. Here he was in a terrible state of the shakes. How could he possibly perform this operation? So Ann and I undertook a day and night tapering down operation. And on the morning of the 3rd day, the day of the operation, it being about 4 o'clock, I looked across from my bed to that of Dr. Bob, and there he was, wide awake, of course. And he looked at me and said, "This is it. I'm going through with it." And I said, "Do you mean the operation?" Well, he said, "I hope the operation. But this way of life is for me." Well, he was still in rugged shape. Ann and I drove him to the hospital. Just outside, he had a final bottle of beer and 1 goofball, went inside, and performed that operation. You can imagine how we felt sitting there in that car just waiting. But after a while, he came out, drove us home, and then disappeared again with his car. And when he finally arrived on Ardmore Avenue next, he told us that he had been making restitution to people that he had harmed. He was beginning to practice what we now know to be AA principles. So that was the beginning for Dr. Bob and for me. Presently, Dr. Bob said, "But Bill, shouldn't we be working on other alcoholics? I know I'd like to do this, and we'd better take out some protection for ourselves." Well, I said, "Have you got any ideas? Where can we find some?" Well, he said, "I used to be on the staff down at the city hospital, and they have a ward. They're always coming in there. Supposing I call up a nurse I know." So he called this lady and explained to her that he and a friend from New York had a new method of drying up alcoholics. And the nurse, with some asperity, still with good humor, I imagine, said, "Well, Dr. Bob, considering your performance down here, I hope you've tried it on yourself." And he said, "Well, I certainly have." So said the nurse, "Well, we've got just the customer for you. He's just come into emergency, He's black both eyes of one nurse. He's in delirium. We have him strapped down and under control. Well, Dr. Bob made a few suggestions for medication, which the nurse noted, and he said, "We'll be down tomorrow." On the morrow, Dr. Bob and I saw the man on the bed, a phrase that has become so familiar to all of us. We were visiting one of Akron's prominent lawyers. He had gone all to pieces. He had been in the hospital 4 times in the last 6 months. And as he hopelessly told us, he couldn't even get home without getting drunk. So I told him the nature of his malady, quoting Dr. Silkworth. Dr. Bob told his experience so far as he had come, and still the man on the bed shook his head and said, "No, I'm afraid this isn't for me. I'm just too far gone. It isn't a matter of faith in God. I have faith in God, but I'm sure he hasn't got much faith in me. But come back again, won't you? You fellas seem to really know the score." So next morning we came, and we found his wife standing there at the foot of the bed. And our new friend, Bill, cried out, "Here is it, fellows. They know the score. They know what this is all about." And then he went on to relate how during the night it began to come to him, if these fellows can find it, so can I. Bill's story can be found, if you want to read it in detail, in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. At that very hour, Bill said to his wife, "Please fetch me my clothes. We are going home." He went home, immediately engaged in a political campaign. In it, his adversary used his alcoholism, but Bill kept sober. And in all the years since, until his recent death, he kept the faith. Now we see in retrospect that this really meant that the first group of Alcoholics Anonymous had already taken shape in Akron, the city on the hill. I think, before concluding this part of the project, that all of us should humbly reflect on the marvelous chain of circumstances, doubtless ordained by Providence, which had brought us thus far. It required the humility of Dr. Jung in his office telling a patient, "Only a spiritual experience can save you. My art cannot." It required a messenger, his patient, who came to my friend Ebby. And then it required Ebby taking the time and caring enough to look me up. No personal link in the chain of those early events could have been more critical and important than that of Dr. Silkworth, the man we later called the little doctor who loved drunks. We must never forget that it was he who told us the nature of our malady. It was he who during his lifetime attended some 40,000 cases. After AA started, some 12,000 cases. Ah, yes, his contribution was indeed indispensable. He was, I repeat, the little doctor who did love drunks. And all this while, for years before, during all of those terrible times of drinking, Lois stood by me. If she hadn't, I probably wouldn't have been alive to be a part of this change. Lois, at this point, I should think it would be a good idea if you'd put on a statement on here of what your reactions were, first to my seeming to be well and so on, the reactions to the first early day.
Well, of course, I was overjoyed. And when I went up to see you in the hospital, you were so different. I knew something tremendous had happened to you. I knew that you'd never drink again. I never doubted. And I was, of course, tremendously grateful. And for quite a long time, that feeling of joy stayed with me. But after a while, it began to wear off, and I didn't know just what was the matter. And I found myself losing my temper over trifles. Until one day you asked me to hurry up and get ready to go to a meeting, and I threw a shoe at you. You remember? And that didn't concern you too much, but it did me. Why had I lost my temper over such a trifle? So I then began to think of my own relation to you and to myself, my inner self. And I saw that I was resentful, that somebody else had done something that I had wanted to do all my married life. My one purpose had been to sober you up. And then somebody came along and in 2 minutes did the job. I was also resentful I didn't have any time with you anymore. We used to have so many wonderful weekends together. We were so companionable. But now the house was full of drunks and I didn't see you anymore. You were always out working on somebody or bringing some new one home. I love to have the house full of drunks, but I didn't have that same feeling of need. I didn't feel that I was needed any longer. I had been terribly important before in my own life. I had a big job to do. Now I had nothing. I didn't know where I stood. I was still completely grateful for this wonderful thing. But I myself was confused and didn't know where I was, what my goal was. I've had a goal before. Now what was it? Then I realized that I too had to live by the 12 steps. It was just as important for me as it was for you. Not so obvious perhaps, but just as important. So, that's my story.
Well, Lois certainly went on with the 12 steps. As you know, she did stay with AA, and as I have remarked before, she's had about 6,000 more people in this house. And she has posed, I'm sure, to many of our viewers and listeners, the tremendous problem that nearly all AA families have at first. We alcoholics have greatly deformed those near to us. And she has posed that problem and has since been a part of its solution in the Al-Anon groups. Well, let's round out this wonderful chain of events. I began to work with other alcoholics in New York. We began to go to Oxford group meetings, and there we met Dr. Sam Shoemaker, the Episcopal rector. What he gave us in the way of personal inspiration is beyond all description. His impact on us in those early days certainly registered, and the principles emphasized by the Oxford group later lent themselves very readily to the formation of AA's 12 Steps and the publication of our book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And we, from there, go to other indispensable people in the chain. Ann Smith, whose experience had been similar to Lois, staying by Bob. Bob, the first alcoholic to be sober following my own recovery. And then, to make a group where 2 or 3 are gathered together, came Bill. And so, for us of AA, that was the beginning. If this means of communication between us and you proves to be useful and a happy one, I hope we shall make some more of them. Meanwhile, God bless all of you, and Alcoholics Anonymous forever.